Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Lackawanna Pastimes. I'm Sarah Pacini, the Assistant Director at the Lackawanna Historical Society. Today, since it's August, we're taking the back to school theme very seriously. We're joined by our friends at Wilkes University. We'll be doing an update on the Colonel John Jenkins Archive Project, which has been going on for almost 5 years now, since we started. But we're thrilled to introduce our friends from Wilkes University, Suzanna Calev, the archivist and librarian at the Farley Library, and her students Jess and Emma, who've been working for more than a year now to transcribe some of these papers. The Jenkins Archive is a colonial-era archive of more than 3,000 documents, including maps, land deeds, correspondence, and all sorts of other paperwork that we're working to transcribe into inventory to be able to tell a story that we don't talk much about the early history of the Wyoming Valley. So I'll turn it over now to Rich Jenkins, who is a descendant of the good colonial colonel. Who'll talk a little bit about how we acquired this collection and how we got to where we are now, and then to Suzanna, Jess, and Emma, who will present an overview of what they've seen so far.
Thank you. Thanks are in order first. Thank you to Sarah. Thank you to Marianne. Thank you to Suzanne and Jess and Emma. We've come a long ways. I think it's almost 4 years now. 5 years, I think I walked in the back door. Hey, Marianne, I'm looking for a journal. She walks into the library. She comes out with 3. And what they were journals from the 1780s and 90s from Colonel John Jenkins. And I looked at them and I said, wow. And she goes, well, there's 30 boxes upstairs. And that's how we got started. I think I spent about a year and a half, Tuesdays and Thursdays, going up and indexing them. And then somewhere along the way, Marianne, with all her guidance, leadership, and magic, got me on the board of the PHMC archival board. So now that we knew a little bit about it, we got involved and we obtained a HART grant. With the HART grant, we turned around and hired a consultant. They came in from Manhattan. They came in for several days, reviewed the collection. At the end of it, they had written their report that we were going to present with the PHMC. We decided to take them out to dinner and thank them. And then during the conversation, he said, there is a woman who I know I went to school with or had worked with by the name of Suzanna Calev. And get in touch. And that I did. And that's what moved this whole thing forward to a whole other dimension. So now we have, how do we want to say it? We've joined forces with Suzanna and Wilkes and gone ahead and done what I've always wanted to try to do, make this thing accessible to the public. And as Marianne also backed me up, I've always been after people like Emma and Jess to get involved with this and hopefully take it even a step further. Because as they're going to tell us, it's information that really hasn't been seen before. And there's a lot to glean from it. And I'm also curious to see what two more generations, let's say, I don't want to say 3, but 2 more generations, how they view it and how they're going to carry it forward as well. I want to add this real quick. This was at one time, this is how long this collection has been collected and everything else. This collection was at one time originally called the Jenkins, it was part of the Jenkins Institute of History and Science. It was formed by Steuben Jenkins in around 1780. It was literally 3 stories of a large building, which still stands in Exeter, and massive collection. This is only a piece of it. But just for your reference going forward, Emma and Jess, you'll know a little bit about where it came from. Eventually, you'll find the incorporation papers. That's what happened with Marianne and I. We kind of found that out. But do you want to chime in at all, Marianne?
Hi, everyone. I wasn't planning to, but I do want to mention that in addition to the first Hart grant, I think we did get a second after the consultant. We got a second, and that helped pay for the students' time to help us transcribe and scan these. And that was also matched with a local grant from the Lackawanna Heritage Valley Authority. So we are finding funding, which further supports the importance and significance of these records, that other organizations are seeing that and they're backing us up. So that's all I need to say.
And we have applied for a third grant.
Yes.
Suzanne.
Hello, my name is Suzanna Calev. I'm Wilkes University's archivist. I'm here with Jessica Van Orden, a creative writing grad student, and Emma Broda, a history and political science major. We also had Kaylin Hughes working on this project, who was a history and political science student as well. She worked on this project last summer through this past spring until she graduated. We're going to talk about the John Jenkins Papers transcription project and some interesting themes that the students have found while processing the first 10 boxes. We received a basic metadata inventory of the collection thanks to Lackawanna Historical Society's previous efforts. This inventory spreadsheet shown here was very helpful for the students initially, but we wanted to take it a step further and research and transcribe each manuscript individually. When we physically received the collection, I trained Jess and Emma and Kaylin to go through each folder and determine if the manuscript needs to be rehoused into oversized sleeves, folders, and boxes to ensure long-term preservation of the materials. A lot of oversized materials were folded within letter-sized folders and boxes, so we wanted to unfold them and rehouse them accordingly. The first step in this project was to transcribe each manuscript as is. However, when you transcribe a manuscript as is, it leaves a lot to be desired in terms of researchers understanding what's being written. 18th and 19th century American handwriting contains a lot of variances in language, grammar, semantics, and syntax due to inconsistencies in education across different classes. Even the most well-educated or prominent historical figures during this time period have handwriting that contains misspelled words, incomplete sentences, and confusing vocabulary. So the challenge for our students was in familiarizing themselves with these discrepancies. The goal with these transcriptions was to make it as easy as possible for researchers to understand what's being written. So when there were abbreviations made by the creator, we put in brackets what the missing letters were within the word. We can see this within the month written at the top, January. The JANY is present in the manuscript and the UAR is in brackets. We can see this as well with doctor highlighted, but the DOC and T is superscripted and the OR is in brackets. Susquehanna as well is also abbreviated with SUSQ and H is superscripted with the rest of the letters in between included in brackets. We wanted to include the missing letters within brackets so researchers can see what the full-length word is. Additionally, when there were misspelled words within the manuscript, I've instructed the students to write sick in brackets to cue to the researcher that this is how it was written in the manuscript. It was not a mistake of the transcriber. I also asked the students to include the correct spelling of the word in brackets after the transcribed misspelled word. This is for non-English native language researchers who may not know what the intended word should be. So this is one example of how the students have been instructed to transcribe each item within the collection. After the students have transcribed the item, the next step is to fill out the item level metadata. The first metadata section is type of material, which reveals the medium of the material. Most of the materials within this collection are manuscripts, save for some surveys and maps, although those are technically done by hand, so they are manuscripts as well. And some prints and publications and newspaper clippings are included in what we've seen so far. But there are many different types of manuscripts found in this collection, so I've asked Jess and Emma to go further and indicate what kind of manuscript it is. As we can see, there are financial orders, correspondence or letters, financial receipts, sheriff's deeds, memorandums, meeting minutes from committees formed by the Susquehanna Company, estate inventories that lists items from an estate, and petitions, just to showcase a few of these different types, just so that you can see the differences. The description section is perhaps the most important section within the item level metadata fields because it's where the students provide historical context to the transcriptions. This is where I've instructed the students to look for clues within the transcript to figure out information about people, places, events, and locations. A good example of this is on the right-hand side. There is a clue within this tax return from Wyoming that mentions Asylum Company, which is referencing French Asylum, an 18th century settlement that was intended for French royalty and aristocracy who were fleeing the French Revolution and French colony of Santo Domingue or Haiti. The students include hyperlinks throughout the description to provide the researcher with additional resources to look at in their research process. On the left-hand side is a letter by historian and biographer Thomas Avery to Steuben Jenkins, in which he's sharing his research on the, quote, Indian Campaign of 1779, which alludes to the Sullivan Expedition, which was a scorched earth campaign in which George Washington ordered Generals John Sullivan and James Clinton's armies to burn Iroquois villages as a response to attacks in a number of territories, including the Wyoming Valley in the Battle of Wyoming. Here we're also seeing the students include hyperlinks to specific battles, events, and other important information that researchers would want to know when reading this manuscript. Other metadata sections that students filled out were the locations, conditions, and measurements. These sections will provide Lackawanna Historical Society with information about each item and whether they would want to pull the material for researchers or potentially provide them with a digitized copy if the general condition of the manuscript is fair or poor. This is to clue them in to what they would rather do and what they feel comfortable doing. The creator, people, and subjects metadata fields allowed the standardization across the collection. I've trained the students to look up authorized name and subject headings in Library of Congress's catalog. This involved a lot of genealogical research by the students in order to figure out a creator or person's birth and death dates, and looking up very specific terms that Library of Congress classifies as the official term for an event, such as the Yankee-Pennamite Wars, shown here on the right. The students have provided a lot of hyperlinks to genealogical websites for creators and persons when they were able to figure them out. So one of the most challenging aspects of this transcription project was in figuring out specific historical figures' handwriting styles. We can see distinct differences between the handwriting of educated historical figures that show up in the collection and those who are uneducated and ended up spelling out words more phonetically within their writing. Even among the most prominent educated men, we can still see inconsistencies and errors in their grammar and syntax. Jess is going to discuss the differences between one figure's writing, John Franklin, and an example of someone who did not receive an education. Jess?
John Franklin's handwriting is one of the most fun ones for the challenge of deciphering it. This was because some of the specifics of his style, in particular letters, we can see in the words resolved and possession, that he has a stylized capital R and capital D or lowercase d. And in possession, we can see that his capital P has a distortion and the double S with that sometimes looks like an F. So when deciphering it, we have to figure out the word. He also tends to reject punctuation or character rules, such as not crossing his T or dotting his I's. This could be seen in phrases such as not much faith in the act, where he hasn't crossed the F or dotted the I in faith. Or into the terms of the compromise, where we can see he does choose to cross his T sometimes, but then leaves it off in other instances. So we need to derive the context of the sentence to understand the words that are present. And he also does a use of end dashes instead of periods to end his sentences more often. One unique aspect of Franklin's that we can see in very few other occasions is evidence of his self-edits, which is seen in the first image on the left-hand side. He has added a superscripted D for where he forgot it in undoubtedly early on. And he also uses a strong poetic and metaphorical language to drive his point and position home to his readers, such as when he's describing what he considers the nefarious governing body of Pennsylvania. He explains the duplicity of government now broke the shell, and the serpent made its way from the dark conclave and appeared in open light, which is most likely a metaphor or could be a metaphor of the serpent shell from the play Julius Caesar, which allegorizes a tyrannical figure that is waiting to be hatched. These look very different in another author in the collection, William Coleman, who, like many of the other creators, uses phonetic spelling practices in his lettering. We can see this in words such as feel, spelled with an A, get, spelled with an I, and uses D-A-N-C endings for words such as confidence or competence instead of D-E-N-C-E. This study gives us more of an idea of the man himself concerning education and his life within the valley, one that he speaks to himself as he names himself a working man, noting that he and his wife have scratched for all they have in the valley, and plausibly shows a gap in the formal education opportunities of these two men who appear in the collection together. But Coleman still exhibits some of the heavy stylistic forms that we see on certain letterings that Franklin does, possibly hearkening to a familiarity or a reading of script or other forms. And we can see this in letters such as Walter with the capital W, the F in father. And it also adds some difficulty in reading his words when his handwriting is usually legible, because it sometimes looks like they're different letters, which we can see in the middle of have, where the V looks like an R. Next slide.
So I think it's important to note that there are attempts at standardization of the English language from the 18th through the 19th century, with publications like Samuel Johnson's dictionary in 1755 and then Noah Webster's dictionary in 1806, which changes British spellings of English words to more Americanized spelling of English words. Words ending in K, like politic or public, Webster drops the K, and words like defense and offense that end in CE are changed to SE. He drops the U in British spelling of words, so color, C-O-L-O-U-R, becomes color, the way that we see it, C-O-L-O-R. And theater and center, ending in R-E, is inverted with ending it in ER. So we start to see this English language in America become its own unique language, distinguishing itself from British English. These standardizations of the English language occurred towards the beginning of the 19th century, but because these materials were created during this transformative period in America of pre- and post-American Revolution, a lot of the manuscripts consist of a mix of American and British vocabulary and new language being created and terms borrowed from Native Americans. So the students end up noticing these distinct differences from the 18th and 19th century handwriting styles. We can see these distinct differences between centuries in the case of Colonel John Jenkins' handwriting style and his grandson Steuben Jenkins' handwriting style. Emma's going to talk about the difference she's come across between the two. Emma?
Right, so obviously John Jenkins's handwriting is one that became really familiar with us because of how frequently it's appearing in the collection, but also just how unique his handwriting is. As Suzanna mentioned, his spelling is going to be a little bit differently to what we're familiar with because he's using British spelling and also some phonetic spelling. And also, what's really interesting is that despite him being more educated than people like William Coleman, he's still showcasing spelling errors in his writing. Some examples of these are, you can see where he writes the word Wilkes-Barre as Wilkes-Barre with B-E-R-R-Y, which is kind of indicative to probably how Jenkins was pronouncing the word. We can also see this British spelling, like Suzanna said, with politics. It's highlighted there in green. And then also some misspelling. He writes out the word yourself, but he leaves out the E and the L, just a mistake on his part. But also, like Jess was talking about, there's really interesting styles on letters. For Jenkins, his capital and lowercase d's have this little flourish on them. You can kind of see the swoop he has in the word done and considered. That was something that's really familiar with Jenkins. He also doesn't cross his T's. You can see this in the word tyrant. The T at the beginning does not have that cross. And also he has this habit of dropping the final E's on his words. You can see in the word done and aside, there's no E at the end, which kind of makes it a little bit confusing when transcribing, but once we learned that, it became a lot easier. Steuben Jenkins has kind of a very different style of writing. Number one, because he's transcribing a lot of earlier works. Now that he's in the 19th century, we're not really seeing this phonetic spelling and we're seeing more American spelling. We also kind of became familiar with Jenkins's work, Steuben Jenkins's work, because of the paper he's using. He's using this lighter colored lined paper that wasn't really accessible during John Jenkins' era, but that became super familiar. And then also his phonetic spelling was obviously, like I said, not showing up. So we're seeing better spelling. We're also seeing really interesting shorthands. Like I have shown there, the TPS stands for townships. That specific shorthand we weren't really seeing with other people. Something that was also specific to Steuben Jenkins was his styles for letters like W or T. The W you can see in Wyndham kind of looks like an H. And then also his T's aren't crossed and they're written in a very interesting way. You can see with TPS and also the word that. Okay, next slide.
Another fascinating topic that probably deserves more discussion than what we're able to give it currently in this presentation is a closer look at women's handwriting styles during this transformative time period. We can see a few examples within the collection of how women during the 18th century did not receive the same education or rights as men did, and how that's reflected in their handwriting with more phonetic spelling. Jess is first going to discuss the 18th century handwriting style of Laura Chapman, while Emma is going to discuss right after the early 20th century handwriting style of Emma Jenkins and show the differences between the two. Jess?
Laura Chapman is an interesting mix between the conversation we saw between Franklin and Coleman. She uses poetic language similar to Franklin, but hers are more biblical allusions, as we see in phrases such as "from whom we receive every blessing for sparing our lives." However, like Coleman, she just demonstrates a greater use of phonetic spelling for her words, such as the missing E from lives, and then she spells great, G-R-A-T, and present ending with an A instead of an E. But she does also maintain some of the certain stylizations that we were seeing on letters, such as the capital D in doctor and lowercase d in hardly. But what was most interesting in reading her letters was seeing that she has some evidence to self-edits the way that Franklin does. In the two green boxes, you can see that she erased a premature J from enjoy to spell the word correctly. And though she misspells health in other places, she has corrected herself in the bottom left-hand corner green box where she's added an A later on.
So Emma Jenkins was a really interesting example for us to come across because this is an example of 20th century women's work. We're again not seeing phonetic spelling or many spelling errors because at this point women were able to be a little bit more educated. We can't be entirely sure about Emma Jenkins's case in particular because this is the only document we had with her handwriting. But we can still see interesting stylizations for letters, like her T's specifically were not crossed on the actual letter, but they're actually crossed a bit later on in the word. You can see those highlighted in yellow, that the line kind of appears a little bit later. And then it's also really interesting to see that stylizations that were popular for people like John Franklin and John Jenkins with that double S stylization at this point is pretty much gone. They're writing out both of their S's, which is a really interesting change to see how that went from like the 18th century by the 20th century. Next slide.
So as Jess, Emma, and Kaylin became more confident in their transcription ability, they started to be able to develop creator profiles of unique handwriting styles. As they've been discussing, John Franklin has a tendency to style his R's and D's a certain way, while John Jenkins has a tendency to not cross his T's at the beginning of a word. So as they become more familiar with the handwriting, they were able to recognize these figures' handwritings among manuscripts that did not have a signature on them or a clear creator listed. This process isn't immediate, but happens over time. It also allows them the opportunity to go back to manuscripts that they processed initially when they were less confident and determine who the creator is based off of these creator profiles or unique characteristics within the handwriting. This was the case for many of the maps and surveys created by Daniel Satterley, who was a surveyor in the Wyoming Valley. Jess is going to speak about this process. Jess?
In box 5, we found a ledger of field notes that had no formal signature, excepting this front page where Daniel Satterley was scrawled many times. And it also happened a couple instances in the manuscript, which you can see on the image on the left hand, the second one, with the little highlight on the bottom. He scrawled his name a couple times again. We compared this with an earlier manuscript that had Satterley's signature where he testifies as a witness with Biles, Joseph Biles, allowing us to connect those two the two signatures to build this creator profile. Next slide. This was really helpful when we found a handful of maps later on that had no signature but shared similar handwriting styles to Satterley's signature, and also at times where there was a D present, which you can see in the blue highlight, and then he would scrawl his name on these maps sometimes as well, which you can see in the yellow highlights. But it was not his handwriting alone, however, that allowed us to get an idea of the man behind the pen, but also his modern voice that helps us kind of understand him. One of the most frequent notes sounds like a self-reminder to himself of why he's surveying, which is money. He consistently includes the word money at the edge of the page, sometimes circled, sometimes accompanying other phrases, such as he wrote day, money, money, night in the yellow highlight. Like his own name, he often likes to scrawl other figures, which we can see on the left-hand side. sort of to the right, you'll see Hyde, which is a Colonel Ezekiel Hyde. He's also written Matthias Hollenbach's name, Joseph Biles' name, and many others. What was really exciting about Satterley's pieces is that we can begin to infer some kind of level of study from him, because he often attributes or writes different literary quotes within it, which we can see from Delay as the remora to all good, where he's written money and circled it. It's a quote that he most likely drew from the instructor. It's A Young Man's Best Companion by George Fisher, which is a collection of widespread advice across numerous trades and practical skills. We can also further infer some humor on him, because he replaces the original final word from the quote, which is success, and writes money again, which aligns with his own special interest. Next slide.
What has been a rewarding yet challenging part of this transcription process for the students is in learning about what life was like for many of the early settlers of the valley. Students had to familiarize themselves with glossaries of terms within specific fields or disciplines that they were not previously familiar with, such as financial terms or surveying terms or clothing and textile terms. The students have built up glossaries of vocabulary used within these fields that was seen in these late 18th and early 19th century manuscripts. The particular example on this slide is showing how the students deciphered the financial shorthand of different money systems that were written within many ledgers, receipts, orders, and estate inventories. I'm going to hand this slide off to Jess to discuss what she learned about different money systems and how they're reflected in the manuscripts. Jess?
Similar to how we're seeing a range of education during this period of the Valley, the various money systems allow us to see the differing class and financial statuses that are at play throughout the settlers. It was really cool to see forms that I had considered older, such as bartering, still at play nearing the 19th century. On the left-hand side of the screen, we can see that Biles is allowed to pay back his debts for this order in either bushels of wheat or specie coin. Though dollars were more familiar, they were often written out in collections, but there were some manuscripts that had shorthand for cents. In the manuscript on the far right of the screen, we see that they are selling a tract of land for 16 cents on the acre, and it's in an 871 acre lot. However, the most dynamic part of researching these various receipts and orders on the accounts within the collection was understanding the different shorthands and styles depicting pound, shilling, and pence, for they were often shown in different forms. They were in fractions, ellipses, end dashes, and even dots at times. Interpreting these became easier once we understood from other manuscripts that had a header written, which would have a pound sign, an S for shilling, sometimes SH, and a lowercase d, which we found out was a symbol for pence during this period. And it helped us read other forms through that by understanding that the symbol, these fraction forms are what that's depicting. So in item 118, we see that the purchase at 1 pound, 17 shillings, and 11 pence. Below that image on item A, we can see that they paid 6 fraction naught, which is 6 shilling, no pence. And beside this image on item B, we can see the same style, but it's using ellipses with fractions. Next slide.
Emma's going to discuss what she's come across with reading early credit and debit accounts and how we're supposed to read them. Emma?
So when we were looking at these accounts, we noticed a lot of the use of these shorthands DR and CR, which we later learned stood for debtor and creditor. And we were able to figure out a lot about these accounts through these shorthands, with the debtor meaning this account that tracks a person buying goods or services, and then the creditor being the person who the money is being paid back to. You can see on the example on the left, we have Amos Maylert is the creditor who's selling goods to Chapman Biddle, who's the debtor. And we can see under this credit section, the CR, that Biddle is paying back this money he owes through installments. Bartering, like Jess said, is still being used, so the credit being paid back is not always returned in cash. As you can see on the right, Christopher Densmore explains this through the example, saying, on page 39, a ton of hay is traded to Cook in exchange for his services in butchering hogs and shearing sheep. Also included is the loan and return of 2 bushels of wheat, price unspecified. So in the picture, you can see that the debtor is buying 2 bushels of wheat and a ton of hay, which is highlighted in yellow. And then under the credit section, we can see that he's paying this back by butchering hogs and returning 2 of those bushels of wheat, which is a really interesting method of repaying this credit. Next slide.
This particular slide is showcasing another example of the type of research the students had to do to compile these glossary of terms. This one was for specific drinks mentioned within some of the manuscripts. Emma's going to talk about grog and Jed Jess is going to talk about Jill. Emma?
So this word grog we came across was something we were a little bit confused about originally, but we later learned kind of what it stood for. So grog was a beverage that originated from the Royal Navy at around the 17th century. Sailors were given this ration of rum that was mixed with water in order to combat the drunkenness that they were coming across on the ships. They also sometimes added citrus to keep it from spoiling or to keep the sailors from getting scurvy while they were on the ships. So today, grog is still used as a term for a drink that it's a mix of water, rum, sugar, and lemon. But I've also learned that in different regions, it's used as slang for various drinks, most commonly for beer. But in the example here, you can see that Colonel John Jenkins is ordering grog and gin. It's likely that grog in this context meant a mixture of rum, water, and some sort of citrus juice. And the word grog, as it appears in these bills of expenses, isn't always in reference to a drink, as we kind of learned it might be used as a unit of measuring. You can see in the bottom left corner, there's different grog measures from the British Royal Navy, one for a quart, a pint, and then 2 half-pint measures.
Another term present we see is Jill, as in the account with Comfort Shaw and John Jenkins. It was a unit of measurement introduced in the 14th century and was roughly equal to a quarter of a pint. It was initially for describing a single serving of whiskey or wine, but it has gone through different spirits in the collection. The Jill is a larger size of another serving called a jack or a jackpot, which is half the size. An interesting theory that appeared in our research of the term was its connection to the nursery rhyme Jack and Jill. In 1625, King Charles I wanted to monopolize on sales tax, and he ended up reducing the portions of ale that could be served in a Jack and Jill, while keeping the prices original so that he could monopolize on that money. This reduced the royal measure for the Jack to 1/8 of a pint, alluding to the lyrics, Jack fell down and broke his crown, and then the Jill was reduced shortly following, thus the lyrics came tumbling after. Next slide.
Another example is textile research. The students had a fun time in exploring the various clothing and textile materials that people in the valley purchased and wore as they came up with certain financial bills and receipts. Emma's going to talk about tinsel, and Jess is going to talk about cashmere and swanskin. Emma?
So Joseph Biles was someone specifically we saw buying a lot of these materials used for making clothes. One of these we saw was for tinsel cord. You can see he's ordering 1 1/4 yards of tinsel cord. And we learned that, as you can see pictured below, it's in sort of a thread that's made up of different metallic threads and materials to kind of give it this nice shine. What was really interesting about this being purchased by Biles was that a lot of secondary sources were letting us know that this tinsel cord was something that was really only accessible to elites. So it sort of raises this question of whether Biles is able to afford this, or if he was able to afford it at all, and if the material that he's purchasing here was actually this type of tinsel cord that came from the 18th century.
The mystery seems to continue, however, on the right-hand side of the screen as we continue to see Biles buying other luxurious items, such as 1.5 yards of cashmere and silk. However, this particular order offers us an insight into the trade and the seasons occurring within the valley during this period, as we also see Biles buying yards of swanskin. This closely woven flannel material was often used by laborious trades within different regions. Due to its thick weave insulating abilities, it was a quick favorite with fishermen. Researching it was an interesting find as it allows us to see a rich history unfolding, one of developing industries within the valley. On the bottom right-hand side of the screen, you can see a picture of swanskin material gloves. Next slide. Less common, but still highlighted, are the instances where people are purchasing actual clothing items rather than just the materials to make them. One of the purchases was a pair of worsted hose, which felt like a misspelling when we were first looking, but it revealed an actual item. They were a pair of men's linen boot hose made from thicker, tightly spun wool material. They were likely used under riding boots during colder seasons in the valley. Next.
Another fascinating theme that was present in some of the manuscripts was medical recipes that were used in the late 18th and early 19th century. We tend to forget that life for early settlers in the valley was very difficult. They were coming across all kinds of wildlife, and they experienced many different types of ailments and conditions that we take for granted today. Emma is going to talk about the manuscripts she came across with medical recipes and what she learned about them. Emma?
So as Suzanna mentioned, these settlers coming to North America were coming across different medical issues and injuries that they would have came across that they may not have been used to. This is why a lot of the treatments, at least that we came across, were borrowed from Native American practices who had been there and using these practices long before. The first medical recipe you can see here was used for curing a snake bite. It provides information for this plant called Pipsissewa, you can see pictured there, and it also provides instructions on where to locate it in nature. This was likely used as a way to soothe the wound. The specific practice of Pipsissewa came from Native Americans who used the plant for a variety of problems like fever, kidney stones, chest pain, and skin ailments. And it was either ground up and rubbed into a wound like it would be in this instance or used in a tea. The two other treatments mentioned on this recipe take a little bit more of a violent approach to treating the wound. It's probably intended to draw out the venom that would have been there from a snake bite. This is to use white walnut bark or salt to, as the recipe says, blister and burn the flesh. Next slide. The second recipe here is used as a cure for rheumatism. It provides a recipe for a medicine that was likely ingested for more of a long-term cure to the disease. And then there's also another recipe for ointment that was used maybe for more immediate relief. And the recipe for the ointment we found interesting was the use of this material called skunk grease. We learned this is another medical practice originating from Native Americans. So skunk grease, or referred to as skunk oil sometimes, was taken from a skunk's glands and used as a healing balm for a variety of issues, specifically applied to, like in this case, soothe rheumatism. We can see that it's probably used for this warming sensation it would give if applied to the skin. But something else that's really interesting about this that we learned was that even in the early 20th century, it was still being used in medical practices, specifically as an anti-inflammatory, which the Wisconsin Historical Society talks about on their website. Next slide.
Another theme that has shown up as an aspect of life in the Valley concerns widows and their property rights. Jess is going to explain what a dower is and the evolution of dower transcribed in some of these legal documents that are in the collection. Jess?
A widow's dower was a legal protection for widows that secured 1/3 of their late husband's estate upon their passing. The collection offers an intriguing insight into the dichotomy of this practice, as one shows the reservation of those lands while the other is a contract for the relinquishment of them. In the highlighted section on the right-hand side, in the deed by Amos and Ann Stafford, it says, quote, reserving unto Abigail Stafford, widow, the full and free use of 1/3 of the said described and bargained lands during her natural life or during her widowhood, as the widow of John Stafford. The deed protects Abigail's rights to property after Stafford's death. Under this dower, she would have those rights until her death or remarrying. On the right side of the screen, Archibald McCall's dual Virginia-Pennsylvania ledger depicts a blank legal certificate instructing for the relinquishment of a dower. The highlighted section states, quote, being examined by us privately, apart from her, humbly having the deed aforesaid fully explained to her, acknowledged the same to be her act and deed, and declared that she willingly signed the same and that she did not wish to retract it. The widow in this contract we can see is being conferenced by the lawyer alone. In other cases, there have been witnesses present to attest to her understanding that. The reasoning for the relinquishment is not stated, but it may be that the widow remarried, as we see stipulated in Abigail's case, and thus was required to relinquish her dower. Items like these give us an insight into how women are being treated in the evolution of legal matters in the area. Next slide.
So a good majority of these manuscripts are dated during the Yankee-Pennamite Wars, which was a series of 3 wars fought between Connecticut and Pennsylvania settlers in the Valley over who had the right to the land. Eventually, Continental Congress rules in favor of Pennsylvania in the Decree of Trenton in 1782, but this decision instigates Pennsylvania's forcible removal of Connecticut residents from the Valley and results in the Third War in 1784. What's been interesting about working with the John Jenkins papers is that this collection presents more perspectives from Connecticut figures during this tumultuous time period. In the McClintock collection at Wilkes, we do have some manuscripts that provide perspectives on Connecticut's right to the land. However, a good majority of our collection has Pennsylvania perspectives, indicating their attempts to compromise, and those who are part of the Susquehanna Company, as it's stated in this report, make compromise impossible. So in the McClintock collection, we see Connecticut as the aggressors and Pennsylvania appears to be attempting peace. However, in transcribing the John Jenkins papers, it has really allowed us to broaden our understanding of these land conflicts with primary source material showing Connecticut's grievances and their mistreatment as found within John Franklin's journals. I'm going to let Jess discuss what she's discovered within his writings. Jess?
Franklin's narratives are really compelling for their direct critique and expansion on what we know today. Following the Decree of Trenton in 1782, which gave Pennsylvania the right of jurisdiction, Franklin notes that the commissioners wrote a letter to President Dickinson to essentially state that they believed the Connecticut settlers should be left alone until the right of soil can be properly addressed, as seen in the yellow highlights on the right-hand side of the screen. In his opening, Franklin says that this letter was, quote, of the utmost importance to the interests, end quote, to the interest of the Connecticut settlers, highlighted on the left-hand side of the screen. However, the PA Assembly dispatched Patterson's men to the area without addressing the commissioner's letters, as Pennsylvania, in Franklin's words, quote, kept it snugly concealed, end quote. Franklin also often pulls Alexander Patterson's words directly, underlining them so that the reader knows that they are his words when he's directing his correspondence to the PA Assembly, so that he can show that their paper trail is appearing generous while ensuring that they can continue to dispossess Connecticut claimants by Franklin's words. Next slide. His journals are particularly compelling when discussing the Battle of Locust Hill, for they show vast differences from the secondary sources that we have today. Both records can confirm that Armstrong came to the valley to quell the conflict between Pennsylvania and Connecticut settlers. On the right-hand side of the slide, a Pennsylvania Historical Society portrays the battle as being met by equal force, with two armies facing one another. In the end, Armstrong's men are said to have met the upper hand, taking the Connecticut settlers to prisons in Easton and Sunbury. Yet in Franklin's journals, we see Patterson's cruel treatment of the settlers way before this as an inciting incident. He is said to quarter them without crime, withholding food and medical aid, sexually coercing wives. His men are sexually coercing wives, and all before forcibly removing the lot of the settlers from the valley. In response, Franklin says Connecticut settlers retaliated, pushing the Pennsylvania forces back into Shawnee Garrison until the county justices eventually intervened, requesting aid from the state assembly to quiet the disturbances in the valley. The assembly sends Armstrong in, then promising talks of peace to Franklin so long as they temporarily give up their arms alongside Pennsylvania settlers. Franklin agrees, as the Connecticut settlers have been amenable to the transfer from Connecticut to Pennsylvania law and taxes, as they are interested only in keeping their home in the lands that, in Franklin's words, they improved from the rough wilderness. Instead of peace, though, in Franklin's narrative, Armstrong forcibly encircles disarmed men, women, and children at Locust Hill. He entraps them within the militia as he gives their surrendered guns to the Pennsylvania settlers, as we can see in the first image on the left-hand side of the screen. This is where the two counts further divide. In Franklin's journal, the Connecticut settlers are not marched to Easton or Sunbury jails, as the Pennsylvania history states on the right, but quartered in the garrison under Armstrong and refused liberty until they can secure a bail, which only PA landowners are accepted by Armstrong. Armstrong is said to even admit his lies directly to Franklin in this narrative. On the bottom image on the left-hand side of the screen, Armstrong says, quoting Franklin, "If he had taken fair measures as he expected that we, Connecticut, would have been cautious, and in that case he could not have taken us without much difficulty." In the end, it is not until Easton sheriffs themselves come to request the transfer of the Connecticut settlers into their own goals, or another term for jail at the time, that they are eventually marched to Easton and Sunbury. Before that, though, Franklin and others also received bail from other PA sympathizers as they watched them quartered in the garrison. As with all accounts, we have to understand that there is a possibility of bias in Franklin's writing. However, understanding the events from Franklin's perspective helped to broaden the historical narrative that we have access to after these collections are digitized. Next slide.
So what we're seeing from Franklin's journals is his attempt to preserve the historical record accurately. We see these attempts as well within the McClintock collection, which has a letter sent from Elisha Blackman to the National Gazette in 1820, trying to provide the truth about Zebulon Butler's role in the Battle of Wyoming. Jess is going to talk about Blackman's interest in preserving the record and in John Franklin's journals as well. Jess.
Another cool vein of these collections is how people attempt to correct the record and keep it honest. In the John Jenkins papers, Franklin directly addresses his readers in one of his personal journals as he critiques Patterson's language so he can expose how Pennsylvania was using hidden tactics to remain in power within the valley. Patterson often calls his own measures or those of his men as generous and characterizes the Pennsylvania action with, quote, a laudable zeal and industry, end quote, used to affect the purpose of their mission, which is removing Connecticut settlers from what they consider Pennsylvania land. To do this, Franklin often includes examples of Patterson's men, how they acted against their laws and their own state constitutions to maintain power, such as explaining how Patterson and Pennsylvania established a false election of justices in the valley by dividing current counties or townships to create election districts in their favor to favor their own outcomes. It also is how they dispossess Connecticut settlers of their right to vote afterwards. An interesting comparison from our collection is that of Elijah Blackman, who writes to the National Gazette regarding a false narrative they printed about Zebulon Butler during the Battle of Wyoming. His central point in that argument is to, quote, to perpetuate truth ought to be the object of history, end quote. He writes to the paper pointing out the wrong record or positions of the article and critiquing them with his own firsthand experience. Blackman writes about how Butler rose to a command he wasn't supposed to be in and stresses that Butler always understood they were going to meet battle with John Butler, the loyalist, not to parley, but as the record proposed. The newspaper article essentially painted Zebulon Butler as cowardly or frivolous in his actions, and Blackman uses his voice to set the record straight with what actually happened. Both of these instances highlight the importance of preserving the record accurately, ensuring that it is not only recorded in the whole, but that it maintains its truth. Next slide.
What has also been interesting to see in this collection are historical figures who have shown up frequently in the primary sources, but have minimal traces in the secondary sources. We see this a lot with Joseph Byles' extended presence in the collection, as we see an order, a letter, an account of his in this slide. We've seen Byles show up quite frequently in this collection. However, there are minimal traces of him in the historical record. We've come across only a few instances in secondary sources, and when he is mentioned, like in this secondary text, it mentions how his family were one of the first families to immigrate to the valley. He's deputy surveyor under Jenkins and has surveyed territories like Pittston, Providence, Huntington, Ontario, Putnam, Dorrance from 1795 to 1812 so far in the collection. We're also seeing him being addressed perhaps in a mocking way. We're not sure. It was unclear in the letter, but he's being referred to as the Marquis of this area, the Baron of that area, the Lord of this area, basically referring to his expertise in surveying vast areas in the valley. However, in the secondary sources, he's really only ever mentioned in relation to John Jenkins. In this history of Wyoming secondary text, he's mentioned as a superintendent of surveys under him, as a deputy under Jenkins. In the history of Luzerne County secondary text, he's also mentioned as a deputy under Jenkins. We really don't see any other biographical information about him in these texts. Even in death, there's no actual obituary for him. He's mentioned briefly as Jenkins is collecting debts on his estate. I was trying to locate an obituary that details any aspects of his life, but this was all I could find from 1813. So it's important to provide some historical context to this historical record question involving Jenkins and Byles, and in understanding what's going on after the Third Yankee-Pennamite War. There are still tensions and violence and conflicts occurring between Connecticut and Pennsylvania residents from the mid-1780s through the 1790s. Timothy Pickering is sent to the area to try to establish peace and law and order, but Connecticut residents do not trust him or recognize his authority over the area. He's sending letters back to Congress and to influential members like Benjamin Franklin in Philadelphia to try to get them to establish rule of law in the counties. He's unable to establish this legal control over this area because Connecticut residents like John Franklin are still not recognizing Pennsylvania's authority. They believe their claims over the land are still valid. They're still trying to reclaim their land that was taken from them in the Third War. Franklin incites a potential uprising, which he is arrested for and sent to jail for 2 years. As a reaction to this, a group of men described as the Wild Yankees kidnaps Pickering and tries to set his abduction as a ransom for Franklin's release. This doesn't work. He's eventually let go. So we're seeing this continuous conflict between Connecticut and Pennsylvania of who has jurisdiction over the land. And that's when we see the intrusion law passed in 1795 to try to ensure legally that the Commonwealth has the authority to decide who can buy and sell the land. The Intrusion Act states that anyone who takes possession or intrudes upon lands in Northumberland, Northampton, and Luzerne counties that was not given to them by the Commonwealth will be punished or arrested. So going back to Joseph Byles and John Jenkins, we see them show up along with John Franklin and Elisha Satterley in a court case in 1801, in which Jenkins and Franklin were found to have conspired to produce false land deeds under Connecticut and not under the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Since Byles and Satterley were surveyors and were mapping out these territories, it makes sense that they were also charged with this crime initially. They were violating the Intrusion Act of 1795. However, Joseph Byles and Elisha Satterley are found not guilty, and initially John Franklin and John Jenkins were found guilty, but eventually the charges were dismissed and discharged on other grounds, as it states back in this slide. So despite these court proceedings, Franklin and Jenkins are thought of honorably in the historical record, whereas Byles is nowhere to be found. So we were asking ourselves, why is there an erasure of this man's history and legacy in the secondary sources when he shows up so much in the primary sources? And part of what we have deduced so far is that this might have something to do with a strained relationship with Jenkins towards the end of his life. We're seeing within these letters that this also falls into the historical context of their roles in the valley. Jenkins is still employed under the Susquehanna Company in the 1790s, and Byles is employed under Jenkins. So we're seeing them both experience money troubles of not getting paid for their work. Jess is going to talk about what she's found in the manuscripts that reveal this struggle. Jess?
As Susanna said, they're both experiencing an accruement of debt. What is most interesting is how they respond in their professional voices within these two manuscripts, which may allude to some of the public record that survives them. On the left-hand side of the screen, John Jenkins compiles a ledger of his work in laying out townships and traversing the line for the purchase. He depicts who he paid for how many days' work and the cost of his and his men's lodging. On the final page of the ledger, he writes a note totaling these accounts and writing to the company to request the money that he believes he's due. He even gives instances of what he has previously been paid, but ultimately he leaves it up to the company to decide what they believe his work is worth. However, the final line, his language can hint to some of that accruing debt and stress that he may be feeling. As he says, I see no reason why one man should be out of his business and fatigued for the company which others remain idle at home. In contrast, on the right-hand side of the screen, Byles seems to be suffering money issues with individual landowners. In the item on the right, a person is writing in place of Thomas Sanborn, requesting Byles to finish laying a line for Sanborn that Byles has stopped because he says he has not been paid for. Byles writes, it may appear to me a hard task when I have used every means in my power to neither pay me my wages nor to put me in a position to obtain those points required. Unlike Jenkins, however, who attempts to preserve his professional relationship in his language, Byles resorts to strong language and all but cuts the ties with the account. And highlights, he says, I can borrow some money, I suppose, but I do not feel freedom to do it. Mr. Sanborn had better run the rest of the line himself. Next slide.
So we see these money troubles come to a head in 1811 with their correspondence. Emma's going to talk about the tensions she's seen from Jenkins' perspective, specifically the language she's seen that shows a strain on their friendship. Emma?
Okay, so from this letter that Jenkins is writing to Joseph Byles, we can see that Jenkins does end up in prison in 1811. We weren't able to find exactly why he ends up here, but it's likely due to problems with land deeds and possibly his debt that he's sort of racking up. Jenkins references two land deeds in this letter that he had entrusted to Byles that Byles had sold while he was in jail. He's upset by this and asks Byles to send the money to him so that he can have it with him in jail. In this first section, we can see that these tensions are starting to rise between them surrounding issues with land deeds. In the second section, we can see that Jenkins asks Byles, what injury have I ever done you? Because Jenkins has asked Byles never to sell these grants, but he does anyway. So this is again showing these tensions start to rise between Jenkins, specifically regards to these land deeds with Byles. Finally, you can see that Jenkins signs off this letter writing, I hope you will have the pleasure of reading this letter, as it may be the last from John Jenkins. So throughout this letter, you can kind of tell that Jenkins is taking on a rather emotional perspective to the situation. He originally refers to Byles as his friend at the beginning of the letter, but at the end, you can kind of see he's feeling a little bit hurt by Biles's actions, which is kind of a feeling that we kind of got the idea that Biles is not reciprocating these emotional tensions.
Excellent. As Emma was saying, the language is pretty stark between both of these writers, and we can kind of begin to guess at the context of what is occurring between them, but we can't say for sure whether or not one side is true. But where Jenkins' language seems to be more placating and emotional, Biles's language is more direct and self-elevating. Whether this is from the security he feels that Jenkins is the one in jail and he is plausibly free, or he does not have this deed, we can't be sure. What we can be sure is that Jenkins seems to mourn the friendship and expect Biles's help, while Biles seems to only allude to his anger. On the left-hand side of the screen, we see that he first denies Jenkins's claim, stating that he does not have any deed under Kellogg and never made any money from any of Jenkins's grants. He uses more aggressive language, attacking Jenkins's character a number of times and saying on the right-hand side of the screen at the top that Jenkins must be dreaming if he believes any of these accusations are true. What is interesting is Biles's sign-off, following the dramatic tone or possibly more emotional tone of Jenkins's sign-off and question of what injury has he done. We see that Biles has signed himself Mr. and Injured One, even though he mockingly or satirically etches himself his friend first. This harsh language that Biles seems to use may be why he becomes a source of mockery in some circles, as we originally saw during some of his biographical information and other letters, or it may eventually lead to his complete erasure, since he seems to cut ties very easily. Next slide.
So while Joseph Biles is only mentioned briefly within secondary sources, John Jenkins is mentioned in the secondary source material in a variety of different positions and roles. This historical record opens up and explains that Jenkins is integral to the history of the Valley. He has roles as a surveyor, a clerk, a lieutenant, and his family being a huge influence in the Valley with forts named after his father, Judge John Jenkins. All of this shows how he and his family's legacy are preserved in the historical record. We can attribute this to the efforts of his grandson, Steuben Jenkins, who is trying to preserve his grandfather's legacy. These papers eventually get donated to the Historical Society, and it really shows the power of collecting, preserving, and digitizing these collections, and how this type of work the students are doing is providing additional perspectives and understandings on the history of this area. I'd love to ask Jess or Emma if they have any further anecdotes or comments to add about Steuben's efforts. Jess or Emma?
I will say that Steuben Jenkins does what I would assume that somebody would want to do with preserving their own ancestral history. He does that with a lot of pivotal institutions and figures in the Valley that show how they both, his family impacts the Valley versus how the surrounding Valley and its history influences his family as well, giving the collection a rich history of the whole Valley as a whole.
All right, any questions? Basically, yes.
But the work you have done has been so far above and beyond what we expected to get out of this project. I mean, right from the beginning, when Jess said that John Franklin was the most interesting because he had 12 different weird handwriting ticks. Emma could identify speakers just by the paper they were using. You've covered everything from colonial monetary systems to grog to complicated genealogies to try and trace down who all of these people are. Very, very few people have seen these documents other than Rich, who treats them as his own children, basically. So we're glad that you've jumped in and joined the family, as it were, to get involved with these documents. It is one thing to just create transcriptions, inventories of these things that we have in our collection. That seldom see the light of day, but you have gone so far into it, and we are so impressed and so grateful for the work that you've done on this. We will eventually get to a point where we can post this on our website with our finding aids, so other people can see these documents as well. They're about a third of the way through the documents that we have. I said there are 3,000 pieces to this collection. It's 36 boxes, 38 boxes or so. So we're working on it. We're getting there. We will make it publicly accessible as we go. Does anyone have any questions for our for Suzanna or Emma or Jess? Yep.
I wanted to say it was a wonderful program. I loved the variety of topics that you touched upon in so short a period of time. I had a couple of questions about the writing section, because I have an interest in writing. I was curious as to where these people from the 1700s learned to write, that they've developed so many unique styles. Would it have been from a tutor, from somebody at a church, from a governess, or was there a formal form of education? Excuse me.
I think it's kind of challenging to know that until we get through the entire collection, just because we're basically just stepping into their lives. I would have to guess that it would be probably through town meetings and committees and churches, probably their involvement. Although, Rich, do you have any insight into this? I'm just curious.
So real quick, Colonel John Jenkins, he is living in Norwich. He's born in Colchester. He's living in Norwich up until the age of 21. So Norwich is the third largest town in Connecticut at that point. And not only that, the judge, his father, was a school teacher, and the first school teacher in the valley as well. So I'm assuming that's how he got his formal training or whatever, kind of in a regular situation, living in a town like Norwich, and his father happens to be the teacher, but there was a teacher, not like you said, maybe through politics or legislation, legal matters and things like that. Mm-hmm. But that much I do know.
Okay.
I would make one inference.
Sure.
Again, it would be just reading from the context of her letter, but Laura Chapman, there was so much that I wanted to say about her, but while she does use phonetic spelling about a lot of stuff, most of her like biblical phrases like blessing and those things, those are correctly spelled. And there are like certain words that I know that are in like religious texts, like obligation, that's spelled correctly in her work. So I'm assuming that she has to, and her context of her letter is mostly familial, but then she talks about a encroaching church that is putting a different dogma and doctrine out. And so she's basically requesting her brother to come back and help like kind of fight off this imposing doctrine that's coming in that she feels very like against. But I think that those allusions make me feel like her in one particular stance that maybe reading religious texts is somewhat helping those particular people who don't have formal education.
I had picked up on that also. And just one other quick comment. I wondered if there had been tutors from like Germanic speakers, because they used two things that were still very common in German languages: the capitalization of nouns, regardless of whether they were proper or common nouns. That's still done today. And the Eszett, which is that double S, up until 30 years ago was still used in German writing. So I wondered if there was a tutor or a congregation or something, and that's why I asked the question. But I enjoyed the whole program. You all did a wonderful job, and thank you for sharing it.
There's a question in the chat from Tori. Rich, if you want to take this, this is not being familiar with the history of the collection. Who originally had custody and the good fortune for us to box up the collection? So if you could go through the Steuben, Jenkins, Wilcox chain to get it to where it is today.
So Charles Minor wrote a history of Wilkes-Barre, early one, Wyoming he calls it actually. But he complains that the Jenkinses have all the documents in barrels up in their barn. So they've held this material for a long time. And when you start to look at all this stuff, it's Jenkins and somebody else, or there's a transaction going on or something. So I think it's a collection of documents. And then you also have to remember, they were military men, they were legislators, they were agents of the Susquehanna Company. So a lot of these documents would come to them like that. Excuse me. So the family there's even complaints from John Jenkins's siblings when the judge dies. their father, when their father dies, the judge, that they can't really settle the estate because he has all the papers. So flash forward, Colonel John Jenkins's youngest son was James, and James inherited that portion of what was probably 1,800 acres. At one point, they owned West Pittston, Exeter, Wyoming, 44. They owned a whole section all through there, and each one of these 4 or 5 sons got a slice, i.e. a township, Exeter, Wyoming, whatever. So they needed that to settle the papers. Now, so James has his son Steuben. So this is Colonel John Jenkins's grandfather. Now inherits the family house, the Jenkins house, from his father James, from Colonel, and all those documents. Now he's an attorney on his own and a postmaster for the United States, so he's kind of document orientated. He puts his thing together and he incorporates it. The incorporation papers are in the collection. We found them. Couldn't find the indices, but we found the incorporation papers. He forms his Jenkins Institute of History and Science. 1790, he dies. He has married one of his daughters to a man by the name of William Alonzo Wilcox. He's also an attorney. He's also an historian. When Steuben dies, Wilcox basically takes this collection over. Like I said, 3-story building. It's on the corner of 8th and Wyoming, I believe, roughly right at Exeter, across from the Shoemaker's Art Building or whatever. Anyways, but absolutely full. I mean, I even heard stories of a piston off the Sturbridge lion. You know, he had collected all of his life, the largest collection of Indian artifacts. So about 6 or 7 years ago, even before I came here, I was buying off of eBay out of a collection of documents from a woman in Colorado, which turned out to be a relative of mine, and she might have had 10 boxes of stuff between her and her siblings. I've got a couple of the items, but they have that particular notation on them, like 72-11. That's how we could tell these were originally part of this collection. So the collection was huge. Now, at Wilcox, I think, was the demise of the total overall picture. I mean, like, I think this collection was 2 to 3 times bigger. It just in archival paper documents, let alone hard artifacts. So it goes to Wilcox. He and his wife, I believe, at this point, are living in Scranton. He passes away, and in 1945, it's brought down here, and just left here. We don't. I mean, the accession papers. That we don't know. So that was it, and there we are. You know, and.
So that's how it came to us.
Busy.
Sort of like leaving a baby on the doorstep. Not unlike a baby on the doorstep. Yeah, we have 30 some boxes of Jenkins collection now. But it came to us through Wilcox, who was a descendant of John Jenkins. Is the quick and dirty version of how it ended up with us. So anybody else very quickly? Gail?
Yeah, do the boxes seem to be in any order? And what's the most recent thing that you found?
Rich, you have a better sense of the overview of the collection. Susanna's only seen a part of it.
Oh, so
we reorganized and are reorganizing as we go. There are William Wilcox papers mixed in with it that are more recent, but of the colonial era, they go. I'm not sure where that ends off.
So they go roughly, let's say, within. So we decided to call them the John Jenkins papers because there was 2 John Jenkinses. There's actually been about 6 since 1635, but there was 2 John Jenkinses involved in this in this collection. And that's why I wanted to ask the two girls was, have you discerned between Judge Jenkins and Colonel Jenkins? Because you're going to find some. So what happens is in 1784, in the last battle of the Yankee-Pennamite War, everybody gets kind of pushed out of town. I shouldn't say the last battle. In 1784, they get pushed out of town, and John Jenkins and Stephen Harding are on their way to. They're walking with canes. It's written this exodus up to Goshen, New York, and he passes away. So anything after 1784 with a date on it, is the colonel, is his son. But those documents before 1784, if you can't you might want to look at them, like look at the subject matter, and you'll discern that it's something different. And really, I think that the judge was the sharper of the two. He just didn't get to let. I think the Susquehanna Company might have gone a little further in a little bit different direction. Like I said, the colonel is 19 years old and tossed off into the wilderness, whereas the father's quite a bit older. He's helped develop the Susquehanna Company, or the Delaware Company and the Delaware Company as well. Just much more of a diplomat and a politician than I think. I think it was all thrown on the colonel. Once his father dies, he's thrown in this position. I don't think he really was ever developed or advanced in that direction. But anyway, I can keep going. But
What's the most recent?
The most recent, now, then you also have to jump. So we make a jump. The colonel dies in 1827. So we know that's another cutoff date. But then with his grandson Steuben coming in, probably more around, well, I mean, Steuben's probably not of age to really get involved with until 1840, 1850 roughly. But he's collecting documents from other people as well. There's lawsuits in there, but Steuben carries it quite a bit forward. Steuben carries it almost to 1880, 1890, with his either renditions of events or copying of documents, that kind of thing. And then what we kind of decided was Wilcox, at most of his stuff, some of it went up until the 20s and the 1920s and 1930s, but it was involved with the organization of Methodist churches throughout northeastern Pennsylvania. Most of his private correspondence. So it's still within the collection, but we didn't have it. Suzanne, we kind of culled it. Did we say we culled it? Yeah, we just didn't think, we didn't have time and the energy to really concentrate on this stuff, but it still exists. So it goes 1770, 1760, some of those documents, actually even a little bit further. There's copies of the minutes in there by Samuel Gray. It's in a little book, and they're kind of pieces of paper put in there. But when you look at it, Steuben had grabbed the original minutes that were sent out with the Susquehanna Company, and preserved them back in 1860 or 1870. But yeah, 1750s all the way up to 1920. I'd say 1890 is what we have now, because we took all the Wilcox stuff up.
So we cover a lot of ground. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Rich, for taking this on in the first place to dig into these documents that no one had looked at in so many years, and to Suzanna, Jess, and Emma for doing such an excellent job of digging into it. We're thrilled with how far above and beyond you've gone, looking into the history of this, into the background of odd colonial era traditions and language, and you become personally acquainted with the men and women in these letters. We're thrilled with the documentation that you're creating from this. It'll be an excellent resource that we will share on our website to put out in the public as a source for researchers and scholars and anyone else just curious about the colonial era in the Wyoming Valley. So thank you again for doing this, for taking this on, for the work that you're doing, that you're continuing to do for us. And thank you for chiming in today to teach us about, show us about what you've been doing in the last year or so. Our next program for Lackawanna Pastimes in September will be joined by Tony DeSantis, who's an educator with the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources. He'll be talking about the Lackawanna Archipel Pothole and the Lackawanna State Park. So we'll be looking at some of the natural resources of Lackawanna County next time, rather than archival things. So we're moving outside from in the library. Hope you can join us next time. And again, thank you everyone. Have a lovely day.